In a major speech on the war in Ukraine lasting an hour and 45 minutes, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has announced that his country's suspending its participation in the last nuclear arms treaty that it has with the United States, and warned he's putting new ground-based nuclear weapons at combat readiness. The arms treaty, called the New START Treaty, limits the number of nuclear warheads that the two powers can deploy. The U.S., Putin says, is trying to destroy Russia and risks turning a local war in Ukraine into a global conflict.
In the beginning of February this year, there was a statement from the North Atlantic Alliance demanding that Russia returns to the Strategic Arms Treaty, as they call it, including allowing inspections of our nuclear defense facilities. I don't even know what to call it. It's a theater of the absurd.
The New START Treaty does allow each side to inspect the other's nuclear sites, up to 18 times a year, but they were put on hold 3 years ago due to the pandemic. Talks to resume it last November were canceled, and the U.S. has called that hiatus a violation. The treaty also limits both sides to 1,550 warheads and how many bombers they have, and combined they hold over 90% of the world's nukes. Now, the Russian president is emphasizing that Moscow isn't completely abandoning the treaty, but is suspending it, putting it on ice. He mentioned France and the UK, too, which also have nuclear weapons, and that their arsenals may need to be taken into account for any future discussions. Putin also said, without citing evidence, that some leaders in Washington were considering restarting American nuclear tests, and that if the U.S. did so, that Russia would be ready to conduct their own. The U.S., Russia, France, and the UK all stopped nuclear testing in the 1990s. Putin's announcement came as U.S. President Biden was meeting NATO allies in Poland a day after his surprise trip to Kiev. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called the development irresponsible and that the U.S. would be what he called postured appropriately.
This is just the latest move by a nuclear bully. If we look at Putin's activities, literally since the first day of the invasion of Ukraine, he has been making nuclear threats. He has been talking about the importance of Russia's nuclear arsenal. He has been increasingly relying on nuclear weapons to throw his weight around and to try to keep the US and NATO from offering support to Ukraine. And so what he gets out of this, it's really just another step in the nuclear bullying. He is intentionally increasing nuclear risks with the hopes of keeping out NATO and Western support. This means the end of bilateral dialogue between the US and Russia. New START was one of the few remaining forums for those bilateral discussions, particularly discussions that included defense officials, which we know is incredibly important in Russia right now because the Ministry of Defense is so influential. And so with the end of New START, we're not just losing an arms control agreement, we're losing a really important communication channel. And we're losing that communication channel at the exact moment when we need it most, when nuclear risks are rising, when Putin is making all these nuclear threats. And so it really is a dangerous and irresponsible move on Putin's part. Putin's announcement to suspend New START gives China a free pass. China doesn't want to participate in arms control. China is opposed to really any transparency into its nuclear arsenal or into its nuclear doctrine. And if US-Russia arms control is breaking down, it doesn't put any pressure on China.
Of operations and advocacy for the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. A world without nuclear arms control is a far more dangerous and unstable one, with potentially catastrophic consequences. Every effort should be taken to avoid this outcome, including through an immediate return to dialogue. I will reiterate the Secretary General's position, which has been clear, and that is that the U.S. and the Russian Federation should resume the full implementation of the New START Treaty without delay. The New START and successive bilateral treaties on strategic nuclear arms reduction between the two countries have provided security not only for Russia and the United States, but for the entire international community.
And are there any trucks not getting in to the Syria side?
I can't speculate on what countries may do. What we do know is that it is vital to have continued high-level engagement between the world's two powerful nuclear powers, and that is why we call for a resumption of the full implementation by all parties of the New START treaty.
Well, the New START treaty is designed to put a limit on the number of nuclear warheads that each side can have. It was going to expire anyway, so having the end of the treaty come is not going to change very much in the substance of military relations between the two, but it might be symbolic that the Russian side is going to use nuclear weapons to escalate the political disagreements that it's got in the world today. What the treaty did was limit how many warheads there could be and how many missiles each side could have. The treaty was going to expire. Now the Russians have said they will not renew it when it does expire, so that will end. But there hasn't been very close compliance with it over the last few years anyway. The inspections that were supposed to happen weren't happening because of COVID and then because the Russians wouldn't allow it. So I think what we're seeing in world politics now is that Russia is much bolder about using its military to expand its sphere of political influence in quite cruel ways. And so that's a signal, I guess, that we may be entering a more militaristic phase of relations between the US and Russia, the world and Russia. But the treaty was probably not going to prevent that even if it was renewed. Yeah, President Biden made a very forceful speech on foreign relations this week where he asserted quite plainly that the United States is interested in helping Ukraine resist Russian aggression, and hinted more generally that the U.S. is interested in helping the rest of the world resist Russian aggression as well. So that may escalate the stakes in a way, but it's probably something that many of the neighbors of Russia would quite welcome, since this emboldened Putin is looking quite frightening to many of his neighbors. So the idea that the U.S. is standing with those neighbors is going to be heartening to a lot of countries. It seems quite clear that if the U.S. and others weren't providing weapons to the government of Ukraine, the country would have collapsed in the face of the Russian invasion long before now. And so if any time the outside world stops arming Ukraine, that's probably what will happen. So it's a tragedy and a terrible situation for so many people there, and American weapons, European weapons are enhancing the war for sure. But the alternative is to allow the Russian government to take over, and that seems even worse to lots of people. So it looks like a full-on tragedy where the policy the U.S. is taking has great costs. But the alternative might be even worse. So this is a moment where the tragedy of international politics is evident, but driven by, to be clear, the Russian government. And in his speech today, President Biden made clear that the war in Ukraine is the choice of the Russian government. And every day the war goes on, the Russian government is making the choice to continue it. So the responsibility begins there with Putin in the Kremlin and his quite cruel desire to crush Ukraine in order to overthrow its political independence. It's certainly a very dangerous situation that could quite easily spread to other countries. There's no sign at the moment that the Russian government is interested in opening up other fronts in the war. It seems like they're quite focused now on just controlling that eastern part of Ukraine and perhaps cementing that control and drawing a line there. So I don't think that they will spread. But the amount of military hardware flying around is so enormous that the casualties and the civilian costs are astronomical. And it's very easy in such a militarized situation for things to go awry and yet more innocent people get killed. So it's certainly a very dangerous situation for everybody nearby.